Maggie came along in 2010 and she was born 2 weeks after Sadie's birthday. She was supposed to be born about 4 days later, but she would not wait, and I went into labor on July 3rd. And when I got to the hospital, they started giving me drugs to slow down my labor, and Maggie didn't want to wait. On the morning of July 4th, they checked me, and they weren't sure if the doctor was going to make it. And honestly, I was kind of hoping that maybe she would be born really fast and that I was going to get my dreamed of VBAC that the hospital wasn't going to let me have, because there were no hospitals within 4 hours that did VBACs, because the reason that they gave was there was no anesthesiologist on the floor in case there was an emergency. The only way that I was going to have a VBAC was if I accidentally had one, because not having the baby in the hospital really wasn't an option for me especially after my first experience. My doctor made it. They very, very quickly got me into the operating room, and Maggie was born a short while later after a spinal. It was easy. It was quick. She was 9 pounds 1 ounce. She was 21 inches long. When Sadie was born, the doctor lifted her up and said, "I knew she was going to be huge," which I'd asked her so many times if she thought she was going to be big, and she would never admit that to me until after she was born, which again was probably for the best. So Maggie was 9 pounds 1 ounce and 21 inches long, and she was the complete opposite of her sister in any way that I could think of in terms of temperament. Sadie had been colicky and difficult and just cried all the time, pretty much from the moment that she was born. Her birth had been so difficult, and it had just extended over into her babyhood and into every other thing that happened after that. Maggie's birth was easy, and she came out as the easiest baby. She just slept nonstop. Too much. I was worried about how much she was sleeping. When the pediatrics, they came in with a team of 4 doctors to look at her, 3 residents, and the attending doctor came in and we're looking at her, and I asked him if he thought she was okay because she was sleeping for 4 hours at a time and then I was having to wake her up, and he told me just to enjoy it. And so I tried to, but after Sadie it was a little bit unnerving. She was just so good and so quiet, and after having such a colicky high needs baby who Sadie had only just started to really become easier towards her 2nd birthday. From 18 to 24 months, she kind of started to settle down, and she actually started to sleep more than an hour at a time. It was so strange to have this newborn that actually slept and ate and was just happy all the time. And that was how Maggie was as a baby. So her birth was pretty uneventful, other than it was a C-section. In fact, I didn't have much pain afterwards. I took 1 dose of morphine that they gave me in my IV right after she was born, and then after that I only took Motrin. I didn't take any of the Vicodin that they offered me or any more morphine after the first dose, and I was fine. That was, I would say, Maggie's birth was probably my easiest birth, and then next came Patrick. Now, Patrick's pregnancy had been hard. It came after my miscarriage where I lost Christian in the 2nd trimester. I had spotting at 6, 10, 16, and 20 weeks. So we were just really nervous the entire pregnancy. We moved in the middle of the pregnancy, so I had to find a new doctor at about 24 weeks, which I did. And I found a doctor that I really, really liked. And he actually said that he thought that I was a good candidate for a VBAC. Or well, for a trial of labor. So I was getting my trial of labor after 2 C-sections. And the only thing that we disagreed on was that this time I didn't want an epidural, and he really wanted me to have an epidural, but it wasn't a deal breaker for him, so we were going forward without an epidural. At 36 weeks with Patrick, I got really, really sick. It was a respiratory illness, and I just felt really, really awful. And I felt worse and worse until finally we went into labor and delivery. At labor and delivery, I saw my doctor, who seemed to think I was going to be admitted. But after he left and went off his shift, the next doctor who came on, who I never saw, decided that I was okay, it was under control, my fever was down to like 101, and that it was just a virus, and they sent me home. And when I got home, I just felt worse and worse and worse. I kept taking baths because I couldn't stop shaking. I was just shaking so hard. But I'd get in the bathtub, even sitting in the bathtub, I would have a towel wrapped around my shoulders sitting in the bathtub, and I still couldn't stop shaking uncontrollably. I got out of the bathtub and I went back and I crawled into bed and I got dressed. I got into my pajamas, but I couldn't stop shaking. so hard. And Paul said, you need to go back to the hospital because I was having such a hard time breathing. I tried to get dressed and I couldn't get dressed. I was having such a hard time that he couldn't get me dressed. I was shaking so hard, and he said, we need to call 911. And I was like, no, I can do this. I can do this. And somehow we managed to get me into my clothes and downstairs, and we got Sadie and Maggie into the car, who were 2 and 4 at this point, and we drove to the hospital, which was only like a mile from our house. And we went back in. They checked me again. The same resident who had discharged us was there, and she was really sarcastic initially about us coming back in. And she asked what hurt, and I said, every part of my body hurts. My skin hurts so much to touch. Everything hurts. And she kind of made fun of the answer when I said that my skin hurts. She's like, what do you mean everything? You can't just say everything, your skin. What's that even mean? And the nurse who was there was getting really upset because when she left the room, she's like, what, has she never been sick before? But then they got my blood results back. And there was some blood tests that had spiked from 0 the first time I'd been there to 25. It was something that they measured that had gone from 0 to 25 between the time I'd been there the first time and the time I was there the second time. And that was when everyone started to kind of freak out. And my doctor was called back in, and he came in, and he was really upset that I'd been discharged in the first place. They started running all of these tests. He told me that if it was his wife in my shoes, he would suggest an amnio. And so he did an amnio, and Patrick moved his butt into the needle in the middle of the amnio, so he had to pull the needle back up, and he had to just do it a second time. So I got stuck twice with that giant needle, and Paul had to go home with the girls at that point, so one of the nurses came over and held my hand because there were like several people in the room watching him do the amnio too, who'd come in to observe it. And he'd explained to me that there's a chance this is going to break your water, but you're 36 weeks along, so worst case scenario, we'll deliver the baby at 36 weeks. That's not a really bad thing. But it didn't break my water, and it showed that there was an infection. There was not an infection in my amniotic fluid, which was what the fear was when they saw that number spike up so high. Then they took me and they moved me into the special OB unit. The next thing that happened was I got turned over to infectious disease. And the infectious disease guys came in, and the main doctor came into the room the next morning, and he said, well, if this is bacterial, you are probably going to die, and if it's viral, you'll probably live and will know within the next 4 days. And he was with 3 residents who all looked like they were going to die when he said that. They were all younger. They were just like... So obviously, it was not bacterial. Actually, I don't know. I was put on, I think it was clindamycin, vancomycin. I was put on 4 serious IV antibiotics for 4 days. And they tested me for every single thing that they could think of, and they never found out what I had. They called it a mystery illness, and infectious disease was seriously bothered by the fact that they could not figure out what I had and what it was that made me so sick. But we were discharged, and by the time I got discharged, I looked like I had been beat up, because from my wrists, I had 15 IVs fail while I was during those 4 days. And so from here to here on both arms was just nothing but bruises all the way up my arms. That was fun times. That was a tough week, but we made it through it, and I was no longer feeling like I was gonna die, and we got to go home, and I was still pregnant. And I made it to my induction day, and in the morning when I called to make sure there was still a spot for me, they said, nope, sorry, we're too busy. And I was like, but the thing is, so when I'm really pregnant, I have contractions from 24 weeks onward, full-blown contractions. I get to 3 or 4 centimeters very, very early, and I have powerful contractions that the things read nonstop. It hurts. And by the time I'm like 30 weeks onward, I'm having contractions anytime I'm walking around, and by the end I've been having contractions that don't stop all the time. They just don't progress. I never progress. That is the thing. That's why I can't have babies the regular way. They never progress. So I knew that if I went in, that I was probably going to be a 4, and that I was probably going to be having contractions that were like 3 minutes apart. I went and I walked around for a little while, and then I went in, and they checked me, and I was at like 3.5, so not quite enough to get me admitted, and I was having regular contractions, but because I didn't have any progress, they were just about to send me home when my doctor called and said, no, you're keeping her. And so they moved me over to a room, and while he was on his way down to the room, my water broke on its own. They'd done an ultrasound and they saw that Patrick was head down, in the right position, ready to be born. Everything was perfect. I've been doing the whole hypnobabies thing. I was going to have this baby naturally. It was going to work. I was all about doing this the right way this time. The right way. There is no right way, but I had in my mind this perfect birth, and I wanted it so badly that I convinced myself that I was going to do this, that the other times I probably could have done it, which isn't true. I couldn't have. I would have died. We would have died. But I'd been in a lot of mom groups where they just talked about how C-sections weren't necessary, and I just convinced myself, and I just internalized that and convinced myself that it was true and that I was going to do this. So I was in labor for 36 hours with Patrick before I had my C-section. I was in labor for like 32 hours before I asked for an epidural. When I asked for an epidural, my doctor's office partner was like, do you want to tell me why you want an epidural? Once we got well over the 24-hour mark, the doctor who had replaced my doctor when he went off came in. She said that we needed to start talking about a C-section because it looked like this wasn't going to happen on its own. At that point, I agreed. At that point, I felt like I had done everything that I could possibly do, and I was ready to do whatever it took to get my baby out healthy and alive. I agreed, and anesthesiology came back in and we went into surgery. Patrick was born. We discovered when they made the incision that he had flipped during labor and that he was now transverse, even though he'd been head down when we went into the hospital, and that he never would have been born on his own from that position. I never would have been able to deliver him from that position, and that was why things just were not going anywhere at that point. If you liked this video, I would love it if you'd give it a thumbs up, and if you're interested in all things autism, which is what we usually talk about around here, I'd love it if you would hit subscribe, and I'll see you tomorrow. Bye.